Good morning. My name's Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where I get to do a lot of meetings, publications, exchanges on China energy environment. But my favorite time of the year is actually March, where every year except last year, 2020, got to host live film screenings for the Environmental Film Festival in the nation's capital. And the films are always about China. And I'm always lucky to bring in some people from my network to make some comments after the film. And so, first of all, thank the festival for inviting me to host it virtually this year, and finding a really fascinating film that's called Smog Town. It was a 2019 film from director Meng Han, and today I've got two colleagues who've presented and written for me over the years. First of all, we're going to Judith Shapiro, who is a professor at American University, the author of many books about China's environment. The very first one was Mao's War Against Nature. And most recently, it's China Goes Green. What's the subtitle again, Judy, for it? It's a coercive environmentalism. How'd it go?
It goes coercive environmentalism for a troubled planet.
Yes, sorry, I didn't get that totally right. But so Judy's often my go-to person when I want to find out things about, have a pulse on some of the policies and particularly the NGO actions going on in China. And then Chris Nielsen, who's up at Harvard, who has been for many years directing a program that's been looking at air pollution, climate, health, economic issues in China, particularly air pollution issues. And he's the executive director, but he also does a lot of the research. So he's one of my kind of science, environment, health policy gurus. So I brought them in today to give us some of their thoughts about the film that you just watched. And I'll interject some of my opinions occasionally, but I think let's turn the floor over to Judy. So the film Smog Town, it was a bit of a sobering film, not a lot of laughs, right?
Well, I love this film.
I loved it too.
I love this film from the point of view of a professor. My students are always asking me, if China's this authoritarian polity that believes in ecological civilization, why can't they just wave a wand and implement all these policies? And I think that this film does a fantastic job of explaining this. Can I give a couple context notes though for the audience?
Sure, yeah, because they've watched the film, and that's why I brought you two in, because you two can give the bigger context of the air pollution and health issues.
Yeah, so I think that this particular town or city is in a special situation. There's a lot of pressure on the officials because it's right in between Beijing and Tianjin. And the leaders of China are absolutely determined to show that Beijing can have blue sky days, especially when there are major international events or important leaders come to town. So we heard all about the Beijing Blue Skies Olympics and APEC Blue and G20 Blue and on and on. And so the problem is that that Beijing can't just close down the factories and close down the traffic and have a blue sky. They're part of a giant basin. And so when these factories from Hubei, when they don't shut down, the wind blows and it's all over. So these poor local officials, I think what this film does so well is it shows how hard it is to be a local environmental official. Yeah. With this enormous pressure, these top-down targets. So these people in this film are trying to get off the bottom of the list of the most polluted cities in China. They're the bottom 5, right? They're trying to get off of it. And it's not because they love, clean air so much, it's because their salaries and their promotions and even whether they can hold on to their jobs depend on whether they can meet these targets. And at the end of the film, we actually see that the mayor lost his job because they did not achieve their target.
Yeah, and it was, what happens on the ground in China, it's pretty much a black box for a lot of us in the US. And I was really struck with just how, the relationship about, how they had to go to some really small, women that were growing bean sprouts and making them get rid of their coal heater to keep their greenhouse and their small business going. Chris, give me some of your comments. I was a bit gobsmacked by that, because obviously you're thinking about there's the big steel plants, but they're going after the bean sprout ladies.
Yeah, so as you introduced me, I kind of come at the issues from more of a scientific standpoint, and I think there's a very interesting connection between the human stories portrayed in this film and in fact the state of the science. And it does get a little bit to what you just described. You know, these little tiny enterprises, should they really be primary targets for such a policy or not? So I'm gonna just say a few very quick kind of scientific things about the problem that they're trying to solve, and then explain why that sort of informs, the struggles that they're dealing with, and that I'm actually very sympathetic about, as I think everybody who watches this film is. So the first thing is they're mainly focused on PM 2.5 pollution. And what a lot of people who are not specialists don't understand is that PM 2.5 is not a single pollutant. It's actually it only describes the size of particles. And those particles can have any chemistry at all. And why does that matter? It matters because they're really trying to solve a whole bunch of simultaneous PM 2.5 problems, depending on what the sources are. And a lot of that PM 2.5 is formed chemically in the air from precursor gases. It's not just a matter of turning off, the smokestacks or the tailpipes where this PM 2.5 is coming out of. It's turning off a whole bunch of different kind of chemical sources being emitted into the air that eventually turn into PM 2.5. So it's a very, very complicated problem. Then you have the meteorological conditions, which Judith, in a sense, alluded to. These are these are regional problems. PM 2.5 tends to be a regional haze problem, and there's a whole bunch of different factors there. You did hear in the film at one point they're talking about, oh, the winds are coming from the southwest. Well, that matters a lot. It's not just where the wind is coming from, it's how strong is the wind. If it's very stagnant air, you are actually cooking it and creating more PM 2.5. The humidity matters. The thermal structure of the atmosphere matters. That changes by time of day. That changes by season of the year. So it's an extremely complicated problem. The location of this city, Langfang, which Judith mentioned, is terrible for air pollution. It's in between Beijing and Tianjin, and it's in wintertime, it's upwind of a whole bunch of other industrial cities in Hebei province that are very, very polluted, famously polluted, with lots of iron and steel mills and other kinds of industrial plants.
And a lot.
Guys,
oh, yeah, go ahead.
These guys are they're facing a problem that they have probably about a 25% control over. The other 75%, they don't have any control over whatsoever.
But it is striking what they do, not only going after the small people, but when they were covering it, basically it looks like they tried to cover every inch of soil and around the town. And it just, I mean, it was hard. Judith, wasn't it heartbreaking?
Yeah, well, I wanted to follow up on some things that Jennifer and Chris said. I think the film illustrates the tension in China and elsewhere in the world between environmental protection and social justice sometimes, because these officials are faced with the fact that if they do shut down these larger state-owned enterprises, literally thousands and thousands of people will be out of work. We saw a demonstration, right, where these people are saying that you didn't pay our salary. Presumably that factory was shut down because of air pollution. So instead, they go for the vulnerable, the small person, and the small person, it's like that guy who has the paint spraying factory. It's all he's ever done for 20 years. And he says, we're like rats looking for a hole to hide in, and then these other people are like, they're appealing their sentence of being closed and saying, we manufacture green paints without volatile organic compounds. That's what we do. And they say, well, sorry, it's on the list. We're shutting down all the paint factories. So we get a very strong sense of something actually that I wrote about in a recent book, but sometimes innocent people get caught up in the net of these campaigns and these efforts of local officials to meet targets. And especially the targets and the campaigns, it gets very intense just around the point where the officials are going to be evaluated as to whether they can keep their jobs or not. So if you're unlucky enough to be, in operation at that time, So, another thing that the film is wonderful about is you get the sense that, we think of environmental protection officials, at least in the US, as being, a little bit of a desk job. These people are out in the street. They're like cowboys. They're like detectives. They're, breaking locks. They're climbing over walls. They're running after people who have just absconded, and they're exhausted, right? They're absolutely exhausted. And it's not as if, again, they love, the environment. This is like a job in a massive state bureaucracy that is placing a very, very high priority on cleaning up the air around the big cities of Beijing and Tianjin.
But when you're looking, and Chris, I'm going to have you jump in here. What's really striking though, because I do know, and I think Chris, you definitely must have been involved in some of these, how China was working with the EPA and a lot of US universities about their kind of regional air quality plans, focused on health. And so, so there is an understanding in China that this is a regional issue, but I don't know. But because I don't think as Judy said, I don't think that having Environmental Protection Bureau folks chasing after people in empty warehouses is really maybe the most effective way for them to get at this problem, right? But that's kind of my comment on this. But Chris, you can come in and comment on what I said or go forth and.
There is a lot of knowledge in China about air quality problems. There has been a lot of interaction with the US, and it's been very helpful. But you have to understand that it kind of going back to not deep into it, but the complexity of the problems. To solve these problems actually takes decades of research and advances in understanding all the different sources. Meanwhile, the economy is changing, the sources are changing, the climate is changing, the meteorology. And you really have to, look at US cities. It takes decades. It takes decades to beat back PM 2.5 problems. Now there's success. There is success that results from that. China is actually only about 20 years into building up the scientific knowledge base to inform these decisions or these policies. And what it means in practice, in policy terms, is what I like to describe as brute force methods to try and reduce the problems. They're not using the same very, very targeted strategies that you might have in, California or Washington, DC or wherever, or Paris, or where you're actually how you need to do this for the dry cleaning companies and this for the iron and steel and so forth. They're just desperate to try and reduce pollution any way they can, because and it's driven by these largely arbitrary targets and these rankings. You hear that it's all over this film. It's like, we're in the bottom of the 28 cities and we got to somehow get out of the bottom third, the bottom three. And it's not a very science-based policy structure, actually, policy design. It is actually, I want to mention that Mr. Lee, the main character in the film, at one point he says, and it's a good point, he says, air quality control is a political task first and foremost. And that's true in China. This is intensely politicized. This is certain Judith is sort of mentioning. It's an intensely politicized exercise. But actually, environmental pollution control is, yes, it can be political, but it's also technical. It's very technical. It's very scientific. And I think it takes a more, complex strategic policy design.
Which feeds right into Judith, because you just wrote this whole book about, this one, that they make a decision and they ram it through. Talk to me, Judith.
Yeah. So, I agree with Chris that it's political, but it's not political in a broad sense that we, people who do political science think of it, it's not political in the sense that like there's not really consultation. There's no effort to find alternative livelihoods for these people. There's no sort of effort to enlist the masses, if you will, in the effort. And so the masses are still trying to, like when the inspection team comes, that's bad news, right? Instead of, oh, this is, something we all need to work together on. So in the recent book, we talked a lot about how China's kind of lost sight, or the party has lost sight of the original goal of supervision by the masses, right? The notion that there should be a little bottom up here. This is so much that these officials are looking upwards, and there's no sense that the people should be engaged. We see the school children looking at Miss Director Lee as some kind of hero, but that's the only glimpse we get at all that there's any kind of public support for this.
It was like Uncle Smog fighter or something like that. but so Judith, tell us about, and maybe Chris can give an example as well, but when in your book, you did talk about that there, because you and I both have been having front row seat looking and working with folks in China that have worked on environment. There are examples when the party was open and the government was open for help. Can you give an example of where citizen participation did help on an environmental issue? I mean, I have a couple, but I want you to give us one if you have one at the tip of your tongue.
Me?
Yeah. Judith.
Oh, okay. Well, that's actually a great example that is not in the book. But a friend of my co-author, Yifei Li, he for many years did a beach cleanup, and for a long time, the state was very suspicious, and they didn't know what he was up to, and they didn't support him. And it took all of these years of working with the state to sort of get them to finally feel comfortable that he wasn't doing something nefarious. And now the state, links with him, and they do this, very well publicized beach cleanup. We can also see on, say, the elephant ivory front or the shark fin front, there's been some good collaboration between NGOs and consumers and the state. And even, I would say, on the waste import issue and the recycling issue, where on the one hand, a lot of people's livelihoods have been lost as China has decided not to import all of this waste from overseas. But there was such a terrible public health impact of that. And I really applaud China for saying, look, if you're going to produce all this hazardous waste, then you figure out, how to deal with that. And that will allow countries to, put pressure on their own businesses to stop manufacturing such hazardous materials. You must have stories too, Jennifer.
Well, one that I'll give one, and then Chris, then we give you the floor again. We'll pass the virtual mic over to you. The Foul and Filthy River campaign, where the head of, then it was the Ministry of Environmental Protection, now it's MEE, and the head of the Ministry of the Housing, they had this idea. They said, all right, they sent out on their social media, oh, Chinese citizens, if you see a foul and black and stinky river, take a picture, geolocate it, and we will fix it. And of course they were hit with like, boom, an avalanche. And they were like, oh my God, we said we were going to do this. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm simplifying, but they went to Ma Jun, who is the leading pollution transparency activist in China. And on he has a, for those of you who don't, go look, IPE is the organization's name, but that they helped the government, they made maps, because they have pollution databases and maps that they've made with government data. And so they just took this citizen science kind of data and mapped it. And they got other NGOs around the country to help them to deal with this massive citizen response. And now the governments have been able to more targeted. So instead of just brute force stuff like you were talking about, Chris, they can actually see, oh, this is a really, really bad problem here in this river. And they go take care of it. But Ma Jun and the NGOs are in an informal watchdog because they keep track of like, was this river addressed? And so it's become a really good partnership. And I think that this movie, as you said, Judith and Chris, it shows there's nothing coming from the grassroots up. Yeah, Chris, some other observation or comment in our last
yeah, reacting a little bit to what you guys were just having an exchange about. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the polling in China suggests that the popular, awareness of environmental problems has really skyrocketed in the last, 10 years, probably going back to, at least 2013 and the air apocalypse events that everybody was in the news and so forth. But at the same time, I mean, I think consistent with what you're saying is people may be aware of it and they're concerned about it, but they absolutely do think of it as something that is solved top down, because that's how they think about everything in China. The government, that's how the government is supposed, you know, they understand their government to function. This is for the government to figure out how to solve. And I don't know, obviously they're not empowered to put on, you know, very empowered to put on pressure from the bottom up. And that is a problem. If you look at environmental history in other countries, including in the United States, environmental progress is driven by bottom up public pressure. I do want to say one thing though, and just squeeze this in this conversation, because it needs to be understood for people watching this film who maybe are not tracking the problems more broadly. The truth of the matter is, in the last 10 years, China has made tremendous progress on its PM 2.5 pollution. It's done it through these brute force methods. It was starting from a really, really terrible place and driven it down. And now it's just merely bad, you know, and you know, and that's good and it's laudable. I mean, we have to give China a lot of credit for doing that. We have no idea how much it cost. It was probably extremely expensive in the way this has happened, and also it has caused, you know, kind of inequities. I mean, what Judith started out talking about is like, oh, you got to clean up Beijing, and you're doing that by closing down steel plants and the economic basis for a whole bunch of industrialized, much poorer cities in Hebei and other places around Beijing. It's very, very unfair in a lot of ways. So.
Yeah. But, you know, but we have seen, like, with some of the initial push for the PM 2.5, like with reining in coal. I mean, for those big issues, like we did see, you know, there are plans for, you know, how to re-employ like the coal miners. And so that's been encouraging. But I think that it's a lot more difficult. And I think that, and Judith and Chris, you both have kind of stressed that, you know, if you're going to require that, you know, there's these certain kind of industries that, you know, that they can't do business the way they did before, there needs to be a plan on how to help them. And I think that that's, you know, I mean, it'll come eventually, but, you know, but Judith, you know, with the recycling, a lot of the informal recycling businesses, a lot of them went out of business and others just moved. I thought of the scampering rat thing. They moved to other provinces further out to continue doing rather dirty kind of sorting and recycling of plastic. So it's,
yeah, there's actually a technical term for that. We call it dirty migration, right?
Dirty migration.
So,
But again, I do appreciate, I mean, you guys have made really great comments today. And Chris, yes, it's true that, you know, like in my work at the China Environment Forum, we're always talking about, you know, the great progress in China. But, you know, just like in the US, there still needs to be a little bit improvement. And you hit it on the head there, Chris. We need science that's complex. It can't, the brute force techniques won't work. And Judith, you also said, don't forget the people. I think that this is, between the two of you, we filled in a lot of the gaps. I think helped put the film in a better context. And I want to thank you for jumping in today on this little virtual chat from the movie. And I want to thank the Environmental Film Festival in the nation's capital for once again coming to the China Environment Forum in the Wilson Center. I hope that all of you, you know, watch this film and get really a unique view of how things are working in China and the environment. And hopefully they all listen to this discussion afterwards to get the fuller picture. But I want to thank again the audience for watching, the festival folks, and Chris and Judith for giving us their wisdom here. Thanks again.
Thank you.
thank
Thanks.
you, Jennifer.
Bye-bye.
Always a great pleasure. Bye.
Yeah.